times people find out that we're biblical scholars and archaeologists. So the first question is, that must be so wonderful, finding out, all the ways that the archaeology just proves the Bible.
Right.
And I say, yeah, it is, except when it doesn't. Or
Right,
something like
right,
that.
right.
That's a nice way to put it, Jonathan.
Welcome everybody back to the podcast. Super excited for this episode today. I've got not one, but two excellent guests on the show. Dr. Cynthia Schafer-Elliott. She is Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament at Baylor University. Also, my predecessor here at Jessup. She'd been a longtime Old Testament professor here at Jessup. And then Dr. Jonathan Greer. He is a visiting professor in the anthropology department at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. He was my former colleague at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. So both good friends, really love them. They are Old Testament scholars and archaeologists. They both specialize in various aspects of food practices in the ancient Near East. Done a lot of work, different sites, but they both take interest in different facets. Cynthia's focused on food in the home and food preparation and what that can teach us about life in ancient Israel. Jonathan's focused on practices, sacrificial practices, and animal bones. He's known as the animal bone guy. He had a bone lab at our school. So I wanted to have them both on because I thought it'd be a fun experiment and something new to do, to have this three-way conversation, talking to two archaeologists about what archaeology can teach us about the Bible. So that's what we're going to get into. Before we jump in, if you haven't yet, please make sure that you are subscribed to the channel. We've got great content coming out all the time. You don't want to miss it. So make sure you subscribe, turn on your notifications so that you're alerted to all of our new episodes and content that come out. I've been posting not just podcast videos, but also classes from the Center for Bible Study, classes that we teach. So if you're interested in getting a taste of what we do in the classroom, these are always pay what you can courses. So you can always, jump in for free if you like to just kind of check it out. Have a look at some of those videos as well and see if you like what we're doing and you want to join us in class sometime, either in person or virtually. And with that, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our episode with Doctors Shafer-Elliott and Greer. Everybody to the podcast. I'm super excited. We've got a new treat today. I've got two guests. I'm not an archaeologist. I don't know a lot about archaeology, but I know some really good archaeologists. My dear friends, Doctors Shafer-Elliott and Greer, wonderful human beings, incredible archaeologists, Bible scholars. The accolades go on and on and on. So thank you both for being on here. It's really a treat to talk to you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Max.
Yeah. I guess just to start off, would both of you mind just giving us a very brief kind of background of your journey? What drew you into the world of biblical scholarship and archaeology? How did you get into that? And just give us a little bit of a taste of what that looks like. Maybe Cynthia, if you want to go first.
Sure. Let's see here. Like you mentioned, I'm at Baylor, and I love that intersection between text and material culture. Mm-hmm. And so for me, loving reading the Bible and growing up in, a Protestant Christian home, that was very present in our home. But there was something about ancient history, in particular ancient Israel and Judah, that just always just fascinated me. And when I was in college, I went on a historical geography tour, and we did a dig for a day at Tel Marisha. Mm-hmm. Jonathan knows what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And we found nothing.
Not even animal bones?
We did. We found pigeon bones. That's true. We did.
That's something.
Yes, it is. But at the time, it still doesn't. It didn't bother me at all. But because there was something about that moment, I can pinpoint it to that moment for sure. Because I had never really thought about archaeology much before, but at that moment, I thought, this is history that you can put your hands on, that you can feel and touch, something tangible. And so I've just been pursuing it ever since then. So
That's
there's
cool.
something about, for me, the daily life of ancient Israel and Judah that really fascinates me. I mean, all of it fascinates me, but that's what I tend to focus on, because that's really just, I find just so illuminating.
Yeah. And within your field, people specialize in different things. So Cynthia, you're one of your areas of specialties is food. And would you talk
so is
to us?
Jonathan's.
Well, different facets of food, right? Jonathan focuses on the animals, and Cynthia on the making of food and all of what goes into that. Could you give us a little bit of a background, just briefly, on like your focus on food and how that sheds light on the world of ancient Israel?
Yeah, this could quickly become a food-related podcast with the two of us here.
We should have had a barbecue going while we had this conversation.
I grew up in a food-focused family, and it was when I was looking at topics for my PhD, I was trying to think of something that did that intersection between text and material culture, and that also illuminated daily life, but could also have the potential to illuminate women's roles. So, because one of the things I'm really interested is women, gender in ancient Israel and Judah, and so when I stumbled across this, it was just sitting at my kitchen table and going, oh, wow, not a lot's been done on this. And if I could tell a little bit of a story, when I started my PhD, Jonathan was starting his, and a couple other friends that became friends were also starting theirs. And we were also all doing food-related topics. And we all contacted this one scholar who was at the time at Cambridge, Nathan MacDonald, who had just done his, what did the ancient Israelites eat, or he was about to do it, and somebody had put us all in contact with him. So he kind of got this groupie of foodies together, and that's how we all became connected. So at that same time, there was a few of us who were getting interested in food from a variety of perspectives. So for me, it was more of the daily life, how you could see that both in the material culture in households in particular. So not necessarily feasting so much in elite context, but more daily life context.
Daily life of an ancient Israelite. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Jonathan, what about you? How did you get into this whole thing?
Well, like many of us, and I'm sure this is part of Cynthia's story, as much as we sometimes all lament it, Indiana Jones, right? So there was this perfect storm of that movie coming out, and then a couple of years later, my dad, who's was a pastor, congregational pastor in New England, took a sabbatical, and he took the whole family, and we lived in Jerusalem for 4 months. So here I am as a junior high kid, I did own a bullwhip. I didn't bring it to Israel. That stayed at home, but I did purchase a bullwhip at a flea market, have to admit. And I'm crawling around in my backyard looking for the Lost Ark. Didn't find it, but there was a Roman aqueduct, and it was all, wasn't part of an archaeological dig. So I'm literally crawling around on my hands and knees, mapping it out and drawing diagrams. And something was planted in that time that never left me. And my dad was doing one of these historical geography immersion programs, and so got to tag along with him on all of these digs. The magazine, Biblical Archaeology Review, was just starting to be published, and so I just pore over issues of that. Returned to it a little bit in college, but it was really in PhD studies where I leaned into that more fully. Actually prior to that in my seminary studies at Gordon Conwell, and had a relationship with Harvard University in terms of exchange classes, and took a whole bunch of archaeology classes there, and that just lit the fire, started getting involved in excavations, and met Cynthia and others, as she mentioned, in PhD schools. And I kind of work on the other end of the food spectrum in terms of the elite feasting, especially related to sacred feasts and ancient Israelite sacrifice.
Yeah, that's so cool. And Jonathan had a bone lab, which got transferred over. But when we were at GRTS, it was notorious. There was this bone lab right across the parking lot from like where the classrooms were for the seminary. Everybody knew there were animal bones in this building, and you could go in and look at them, and it was really cool.
More infamous was the goat sacrifice, if you remember.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, there was a goat sacrifice.
It wasn't really a sacrifice, but that's how it went down in student lore. But it was I did a goat butchery experimental archaeology project with some of the students who were taking the lab course with me, and it was fascinating. This overlaps with some of Cynthia's work as well, that it was started as a zooarchaeological experiment. Where do the cut marks show up? So we butchered this whole goat from freshly killed down to the pot, quite literally. But for many of the folks involved in this was the first time they had been that close to animal death and dismemberment and processing. And so it turned into a wonderful discussion of the ethics of meat eating and the industrial meat systems that do horrific violence to God's creation, fellow creatures in our earth. So it was interesting. Went in a different direction, but we all know that as educators, sometimes the best lessons are unplanned.
Yeah, indeed. Well, and you can't accuse us of not having hands-on training at a seminary if you're doing that kind of stuff, right?
It was off campus. The dean made that very clear. It had to be off campus.
John was too smart for that, huh?
Right.
That's cool. Yeah, thanks both for that. That's really great. Would you mind maybe each of you pitching in a little bit? I think a lot of people have, well, we brought up Indiana Jones, certain ideas or conceptions about what archaeology is and what archaeologists do. So thinking people in the church, when they're thinking of archaeologists that work on areas that intersect with biblical history and things like that, what does archaeology contribute to the study of the Bible? Many scholars, myself included, spend most of our time with texts, interpreting texts. What's the difference between interpreting a text and interpreting an artifact or something without any writing on it? What does that look like? And could you give us maybe an example or two that's pertinent to your own journey of something in archaeology that maybe helped you read the Bible better or differently? I think that'd be really cool to hear.
You go first this time, Jonathan.
All right. Well, I'm sure Cynthia has the same experience where many times people find out that we're biblical scholars and archaeologists. So the first question is, if it's from a certain type of tradition, that must be so wonderful finding out, all the ways that the archaeology just proves the Bible.
Right.
And I say, yeah, it is, except when it doesn't.
Right.
Or something like that.
Right.
That's a nice way to put it, Jonathan.
So, and I think there is some, you talk about, Max, kind of the average person within a church or a confessional setting who thinks about the intersection of Bible and archaeology. It's very monolithic, and they forget that's actually just one tiny part of what how archaeology and the Bible relate. And sometimes it's a problematic relationship when we uncover things that seem to conflict with our understanding of what the text is communicating. And so we need a broader understanding of how archaeology and biblical studies intersect, that focuses on illuminating biblical texts, much like Cynthia does with the daily life of ancient Israel. What was it like to be an ancient Israelite? What did they eat? What were their social relations like? And then also some of the elite contexts as well. What was religion like? How did it actually play out in the lives of an ancient Israelite? And then I've come to where I even delight in the complexity of the relationship between the Bible and text, because they're not using the same data sets. They're not telling the same story. And I think that tension is what keeps it interesting and reminds us to be more nuanced in our understanding of the biblical text and what it's actually saying, as well as archaeology. There's been a big shift to the hard sciences in archaeology that I think the negative side of that is sometimes it boosts our confidence, that we still need to remember we're working with teeny tiny bits of data from different sets, and we're extrapolating these wonderful mega theories that maybe.
Right.
So everything's very provisional within archaeology.
Yeah, a lot of interpretation involved. As with text, so too with material culture.
You got it.
Do you have an example, Jonathan, maybe at the top that comes to mind of a place where either you could say there's tension, or that maybe archaeology might help shed light on a biblical text that if one were, let's say, to just read it at surface value, they might think different?
Sure. I can give, I can give an example that covers a number of bases, actually, from the site where I dig. At Tel Dan, the most famous discovery, which I had nothing to do with, and it was before I joined the team, but the Tel Dan Stele discovered first fragment in 1993, second fragment in 1994. And it's most famous for this single line referring to a king that is slain who is from the house of David. And this is the first epigraphic reference to the biblical King David, or to the dynastic house of the biblical King David, within 150-ish years of David's reign, and in terms of how we can reconstruct it from biblical texts. So quite exciting, but folks forget we're actually reading an old Aramaic stela by an Aramean king, probably Hazael, who's claiming victory over two kings, the king of Israel, identified as such, and the king of the house of David. So these are the kings of Israel and Judah. Their names are in broken context, but it's almost certainly Joram and Ahaziah, respectively. So this is a story we know from the Bible in 2 Kings 9 and 10, with the coup of Jehu and this intolerant Yahwistic revival that obliterates the house of Ahab, north and south. Well, in the biblical text, right, so there's the amazing connection point. Here we have mention of the dynastic house of David, and there have been some other readings that have tried to come up with alternative readings, but not convincingly so. Most agree house of David. But the biblical text, this is Jehu who kills these kings. In this text, this is very clearly the Aramean king, unnamed, but probably Hazael, who's claiming victory. So this creates some tension and invites us to dig in a little bit more in both regards, so we can bring some nuance to our understanding of the biblical text, some nuance to the function of royal apologetic in the 9th century BCE, to where this stela dates to, and also thinking through even comparative literature. There's a wonderful parallel in the records of Assyria, where Shalmaneser III, in an earlier text, in the monolith inscription, he's recounting some of his conquests, and he mentions that some local folks overthrew their ruler, Giamu, and they killed him. Well, 15 years later, he's writing about the same episode in his royal annalistic account, and he says, "I killed Giamu." So you see, there's a fluidity here in the terms of how kings engage royal rhetoric, how apologies function, how ancient Near Eastern historiography is done. So sometimes we create tensions by coming with a very flat reading to the biblical text, or a literalist approach to the biblical text that doesn't account for the fact that this is ancient literature communicating in ancient ways.
Yeah, really well said. Thanks, Jonathan. That's awesome. Hey, Cynthia, do you have any thing you would want to add to that? Like your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, Jonathan made the point that we have to keep in mind that the biblical text is an ancient Near Eastern literature. And I think when, as he mentioned, having kind of that flat reading, when people look at the biblical text and they think that the Bible, Hebrew Bible, and archaeology just kind of go hand in hand, that they are supporting each other 100%. I would love that if that was true, but it's not, and it makes things quite a bit more challenging. But that's also when we do have to keep in mind that the biblical text, how the Hebrew Bible, the way we think it was written and compiled and redacted and preserved over a very long period of time, that we don't have these court reporters who are sitting there, taking notes. Well, I should go the other way, taking notes and saying, okay, wait a minute, David, now say that again. Let me write this down. That our perception of how history, or rather historiography, is documented is very, very different than the ancients. And we tend to impose our modern historical standards on them. And I don't think that's quite fair, because here we are thousands of years later, separated by great amount of time and space, and imposing our standards on them. I mean, we all have our phones in our back pockets, and we can record whatever is happening, or rather not happening. So we tend to have a very skewed view of how things are documented, and we apply that to the biblical text. Instead of thinking about, okay, who wrote these, who could have possibly written these texts? What was their contexts? I think majority of biblical scholars, Hebrew Bible scholars, would say that majority of the texts were probably written by elite urban men over very long period of time, and then compiled and redacted and all that stuff. But that your average, going back to that average person, not just women being left out, but your average man, woman, and child, right, they really probably had nothing to do with that process at all. And in fact, we do have to question, okay, well, how much access did they, or knowledge did they really have of the things that we assume that are in the text that everybody knew about? So when we do archaeology, we are left with what's been left behind, right? So it's a very different set of data. We've got the literature where people have intentionally written things down in such a way as to document a certain set of perspectives and theologies and ideologies, as opposed to the material culture, where we have to keep in mind that this is not all of it. This is just the fragments. This is just what's been left behind. So we're dealing not only different data sets, like Jonathan said, but also incomplete data sets. And so we're trying to put this puzzle together, and we don't have all the pieces.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. I like to remind students sometimes, too, of how fluid things are. For example, if you were a biblical scholar early 20th century, prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran and that whole community, that was such a big thing, right? If you didn't have access to any of that, it's not like that stuff didn't exist, but it wasn't on our radar until that, came along. And so, we wonder what else is in the ground waiting for one of you guys to dig it up. I don't know, but
we're trying.
Keep on digging.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I really appreciate the way you both articulated, what archaeology is. It's really not a discipline that's designed to prove the Bible. I mean, it's it intersects with the Bible in certain ways, but it's a discipline unto itself. It's interested in ancient material culture. Its mandate isn't to prove the Bible, and I think that's a really important thing that people have to keep in mind.
It's interdisciplinary.
Yeah. It requires a lot of different facets, right? I I want to think too a little bit more for people who are listening, and maybe we could flesh out a few more examples for people of places where archaeology and Bible maybe intersect and there's tension points. But I guess I'm sensitive to a lot of information that gets put out in evangelical Protestant circles about archaeology and the Bible. For example, I can think of a popular study Bible that has an article on archaeology in the Bible at the end of it. And I mean, I think it's the ESV study Bible, if I'm not mistaken. There's probably similar articles in other study Bibles. But it strikes me that a lot of Christians have been told from people they trust that there is not a single, archaeological discovery that in any way contradicts the Bible. In other words, there's 100% agreement between what we have in material culture and their interpretation of the text. And the reason why that I find that troubling is because it sets up a scenario for people that actually end up looking into reality, like what we actually have, of potentially setting up a faith crisis or faith crises for people. And just not giving people a really good framework. I don't think a theological framework for making sense of the text. Like, I think we have to let the Bible be the Bible, let the evidence be the evidence. And then, okay, I mean, if we have our faith convictions, that's great. Like, let's think about that theologically, what that might mean. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. And I'm guessing, given the context I know you both have taught in and come from, that this is an issue you've dealt with. And I'd be curious if you have any advice for our viewers or listeners, maybe places where they could go for good information and things that they might want to be wary of, and how you yourself maybe think about this theologically.
It's a good question.
Sure.
I know it's a big question, but it comes up a lot. And, as I've been spending more time trying to do kind of more public scholarship online and so forth, I'm just becoming more and more aware of how much of a market and an appetite there is for people telling others from kind of a position of authority, you have nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. It all proves the Bible. And that just makes me very nervous as a scholar.
Rightly so.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem is, don't you think, Jonathan, that people are more reliant on what other people tell them as opposed to reading the text themselves? So when people say, oh, for instance, the Hebrew Bible says all of Israel worshiped, the Lord God completely and, nothing else all the time. They were so devout and wonderful. And I think, have you read the Bible? Because that's really not what even the Bible shows. And I think that's part of the problem, is that even people in confessional contexts are not reading their own scripture. Yeah. And I understand, the Hebrew Bible it's long. It's complicated. It's pretty gory in spots. It doesn't exactly show, some people, particularly women, being treated well. Right. I can understand why people avoid it. But then to assume that it rubber stamps their preconceived notions. Yeah. It's, we have to do our own reading at times. But I do think a lot of podcasts are doing great work, such as yours and others. Lots of good, public scholarship books. Like, I'm thinking of Jonathan's Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament book that he co-edited. That's a great resource.
There's a great article in there on household food preparation, by the way.
Yeah.
By Cynthia.
Well, and I think that's part of it, is that we're waiting for everybody to tell us, as opposed to kind of, because if I think about even that example about Israel not worshiping other gods, I think, well, if you've read the Hebrew Bible at all, right, it pops up over and over and over again. And this is one of those instances where we think material culture, the theory is theories out there that material culture supports the biblical text, in that we find these little clay figurines, especially in houses, all throughout the Iron Age in particular. And the theory is that these figurines are representing, one of the theories is that they represent other deities, in particular, like female deities like Asherah. And so, but when I tell when students and I are talking about religion and we think about household religion and actually what's happening as opposed to what they think the text is saying, because somebody told them, oh, the Israelites sacrificed to God every day and they were obeying all these laws and rules. And it's like, well, if you actually read the text and you look at the material culture, they both illustrate that is not the case. So this is one of those rare instances where the text and the material culture are supportive of each other.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah, I think as Cynthia was saying, I often find that the people who are least familiar with the complexity of the text are the most opinionated about what the text says. But that in either field, in biblical studies or archaeology, as you're exposed to the complexity of the data, it's hard not to be humbled by that complexity. So you asked earlier, Max, what should listeners be wary of? Be wary of anyone who tells you 100% about anything, be it archaeology, be it in the biblical text. It's just not that simple. It's just not that simple. In one of my classes I used to teach, I had great fun reading two publications from two authors who will be unnamed.
I know what you're talking about. I've seen those two slides. Yes.
Oh, you've seen my lectures. Yeah. One that says archaeology 100% proves, and the other that says archaeology 100% disproves.
Yeah.
And they're published within a year of each other. So are they digging in different holes? No. They're not nuancing, having a nuanced enough understanding of the data and the complexity of that data.
Yeah. No, that's so funny you say that, because as I've been paying attention more to public discourse online and stuff, like Cynthia brought up, there's some really good scholarly resources out there. But what tends to get the most attention are one or the other, right?
For sure. Yeah.
Fundamentalist kind of thinking, whether it's skeptic fundamentalists or religious fundamentalists, they're really of the same kind. And I think there's something to Cynthia's point, is a lot of people don't want to really dig in and do their own work. They just want someone to tell them what they kind of want to hear already. And then they just dig in, like they just sink their heels into that and,
and
keep
they follow the same groups or people on their socials that rubber stamp those preconceived notions. And so it just kind of gets, embedded deeper and deeper.
Yeah, 100%. No, it's so true. I mean, when you're thinking maybe like how you put this together with a faith context, right, of people asking questions like, okay, so like, what's going on with my Bible? Can I trust what I'm reading? Because I find that that's a lot of times what it comes down to for Christians is, well, can we still trust the Bible if we learn from material culture that the events on the ground, so to speak, maybe differ from the perspective that the biblical text is giving us? And I'd love to hear from both of you just how you handle that. In a classroom setting, if you like, even in a church setting. I think that'd be really interesting to hear.
I think it relates to some of the things that we've already talked about and that Cynthia was just mentioning in terms of, I think many people come at the biblical text from a modern perspective, a contemporary perspective, and we expect the text to communicate in a certain way that just isn't how the text communicates. This is ancient literature written by and for people in ancient contexts. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't have relevance for us today. Of course, many of us in faith communities celebrate and resonate with that continuing relevance. So it's not that, but it's what is it actually saying and how is it communicating that message? Mm-hmm. So we have, fancy theological terms that we slap on these different doctrines of Bible reading that are really modernist constructions that we try to fit this square peg of ancient literature into this round hole of contemporary hermeneutic doctrines, mm-hmm. and that just doesn't work and creates all sorts of problems for us. Mm-hmm. So it's not so simple to say the Bible says, X, Y, and Z. Well, you may understand the Bible to say that, but are you accounting for source critical, text critical, redaction issues? Are you accounting for the biggest thing, genre? What genre, and how do we identify that genre in a comparative context with other ancient Near Eastern literature? And then the big point is that the Bible isn't first and foremost about history. It's far more concerned with giving this portrait of the God of Israel and the people of God in this ancient context. It's not trying to give us a date or iron out certain examples of where something later with our modern scientific objectivity and our rigor of scientific method is going to prove something right to make all the doubters cry and flee into the church or something like that. That's just what a chronologically and theologically arrogant position to try to impose on this wonderful gift that the Bible is.
So basically, you're not a fan of Christian apologetics? I'm just kidding. No, I think there's some good examples of apologetics, but this is what you just described is a lot of popular, I think, evangelical apologetics is the we're going to use data to beat you over the head with it to the point where you're either coming to Jesus or you're an idiot, one or the other. It's not.
That's always been so effective,
Yeah, so super effective. It works wonders. Let me tell you. Yeah. Yeah, what you just described, Jonathan, I try to summarize sometimes for students with the phrase "let the Bible be the Bible." In other words, like I think it's not a bad thing to have certain doctrines of inspiration. What's bad about it is when you assume a certain way that has to be, and then you superimpose that upon the text.
That's right. Yeah.
Like your point about ancient literature. What's fascinating is what you just articulated, most of the early Christian readers of the text would completely agree with. The Bible isn't actually primarily a history text. It has history in it, but it's primarily a spiritual text. I mean that was like taken for granted in the early church. So it's funny how those things kind of change and adapt over time. We oftentimes assume that our perspective is the perspective that Christians have always had. But it's just not. Yeah, it's not the case. So,
and then we're very selective in our literalism too.
Oh, for sure,
100%.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's so true. I think you made a good point there that I was going to bring up was the spiritual nature of it. I mean, if we're talking about ancient Near Eastern literature, I think for the most part, ancient Near Eastern literature is spiritual. It's theological. Their worldview is a spiritual worldview. Everything is seen through the lens of their relationship with their gods and trying to appease them and trying to figure out what they did wrong and everything is seen through that spiritual lens. So when we get to difficult texts that say, well, God commanded this and God said this, and it can be really difficult for people to be like, well, why would God say, if God's love, why would God say to command to kill all these people? So as you were saying, let the Bible to be the Bible, one of those is to remember not only the genre, not only that it's literature and not a science or history textbook, but that it's also spiritual, theological in nature. And that's how that lens is used to look at everything through their God, their relationship with their God, and trying to remember what, the complicated, complex nature of the Bible is. It's actually quite beautiful.
Yeah, I mean,
if you think about all the time and energy and creativity that these authors and redactors and compilers, all these people involved over a very long period of time, all that they invested in this collection. And I think that's another thing that people need to keep in mind, is that this isn't a book. It's an anthology, it's a library of books, and that each book in itself is a collection of material. So keeping in mind, so when students get to the part where it says here that so-and-so fought Goliath and killed him, but it says here that so-and-so fought and killed Goliath, well, let's think about how, these pieces were kind of put together and what were the possible motivations. I mean, because there's, we can't figure everything out.
Right. Yeah, no, 100%.
We just have good ideas.
Yeah. Well, and what you're highlighting there too is so interesting. It's another facet of our modern thinking being different, is from our modern mindset, if we're writing a history book or something like that, it would never occur to us to take conflicting accounts and just slap them side by side and be like, there you go. But from an ancient perspective, they do that all the time. And that also, I think, tells us that they're thinking about things a little bit differently, that different accounts can be mutually interpretive. I mean, think about the opening of Genesis, for example. But we have these in other places as well. And I think there's something really interesting and beautiful about that. Yeah. I mean, just speaking for myself, I think that the more that I've learned from other, like, archaeologists and as a biblical scholar, it's definitely complicated my picture of what the Bible is, but it in no way has it decreased my faith. It's actually increased it and nuanced it. And so I just want people to hear, or listening or watching, this isn't something to be afraid of. We're not, we're saying there's actually a more beautiful world of scripture available to you. And the archaeological data definitely can play a role in our understanding of Scripture. So it's another tool, I guess, that we have for understanding the Bible well and what the Bible's trying to communicate in its context. Do y'all have any suggestions on? I mean, we mentioned Jonathan's great resource, which Cynthia contributed to. I'll definitely have a link to that in the description, because you're going to want to pick up a copy of that book. But any other go-to resources, maybe either web or print, that you would point somebody to if they're just looking for sound, credible information on biblical archaeology? Or
Well, I'll plug Cynthia's book. There's the 5-minute Southern, Levantine archaeologist?
5-minute archaeologist in the Southern Levant,
In the Southern Levant, had them backwards. But the beauty of that is that all of the discussions are a couple of pages top. So in our soundbite culture, you want sound information in a readily accessible format.
That's right.
Highly recommend that resource.
Link also in the description.
This was not planned. This is not a marketing. Right?
I can add them in. That's easy. That's what I do.
That's so funny. Well, thank you for that. I would say, Biblical Archaeology Review is a good source. I mean, they're especially geared towards the lay reader, but they definitely have like a sensational kind of approach at times. So, but they do get, legit scholars and archaeologists to contribute. And they also do a biblical archaeology fest. They do it. They have in-person and online. So there's some sources there for that. I'm trying to think.
Great panelists. Like Cynthia.
There is I mean, there's a couple podcasts, but there's one I haven't listened to it, so I don't want to say anything about it because maybe it's not. I don't know. But yeah, I would say those are some good sources to start with. Oh, and the University of Iowa has a Bible and archaeology website. I don't know if you've had a chance to look that up, Jonathan, but Bob Cargill, professor at University of Iowa, who used to be the editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, he has a website, and they're doing all sorts of like short little media clips.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so that would be a good source. And then, of course, there's places like the Bible for Normal People and OnScript and
OnScript's great. Actually, I
Project.
had Matt Lynch on the podcast a little while ago. It's cool because some listeners might want to go back to that episode. He gets into a little bit. He wrote a book about divine violence and warfare, and so we talk about what's going on in some of these biblical portraits and how archaeology and material culture actually can help illuminate what these texts might be up to and everything. So. Yeah, OnScript's really good. Does ASOR put out anything for kind of like lay readers or anything like that?
There's the online or the email Ancient Near East Today is a email listserv kind of thing that I think folks can just sign up for.
Yeah, and there's a podcast called the Ancient Near East Today, isn't it? Called that one?
That's right.
Yeah, that they, instead of talking with like archaeologists, they are three archaeologists who take like something that's in the news recently, and they kind of, talk about it and dissect it. And so it's not exactly like a, hey, let me teach you about this, but it's more of like talking about some of the topics of
current
the day.
Stuff. Very cool. Oh, cool. Awesome. So the idea is there's a lot of good resources out there for people. We encourage you to check it out. Thank you both so much for the conversation. This is really fun. I'd love to pick your brains longer. But Jonathan, can I ask, would you mind sharing did you ever present that one paper on the strange fire from that one news story?
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
And hopefully I'll publish it soon too.
Nice.
So it's funny, as Cynthia said, Biblical Archaeology Review, they love those kinds of sensational stories, but as Cynthia said, they really, as much as the title attracts that kind of audience, they really treat it well, and they nuance the way that they present it. So they really, I think, are a wonderful public resource. But I bring that back up because they were at that paper and wanted me to publish it.
Is that right? Right?
I said, first I'm going to submit it to a peer-reviewed journal. Then, then we'll see.
We'll see. Yeah. That story came out a few years ago, right? That they were.
It's an idea I've had for a while, or a suspicion I've had for a while, about the story in Leviticus 10 of Nadab and Abihu and
the strange fire.
Yeah.
And
the fact that the punishment for the strange fire in terms of the way it's textualized into the ritual traditions of ancient Israel, in the immediate context of the story, they're incinerated horrifically. But in terms of priestly ritual going forward, the prohibition is against being intoxicated when one comes into the presence of the God of Israel. So I always had a suspicion, based on the widespread use of mind-altering substances in the late Bronze and Iron Age religious culture of the Levant, that perhaps this was the case, or there was some story that is polemic against the use of incorporation of mind-altering substances in the Israelite cult. And then there was a discovery just a few years ago, residue analysis, of the materials on two incense altars at the site of Arad, which has many indications that this was a Yahwistic worship center. So I tried to connect those pieces of evidence in the paper, arguing that that's exactly what Leviticus 10 is referring to, and even the fact that in the priestly literature, as you both have been saying, sometimes we have different voices and different traditions that are brought together and preserved as a singular presentation, but there are actually differences that are preserved in the account as we have it. So there are different incense recipes, and so I'm arguing that the one that's prohibited is this one that included cannabis, which is what the residue analysis from the Arad altar suggested. So stay tuned. Strange fire indeed.
Yes, I love it. I love it. That's a fun place to end. Yeah. Sadly, they got rid of the fun incense recipe early on, but well, yeah. Thanks both. I just appreciate you so much, and look forward to talking again with you soon. Thanks for being on.
Mutual, Max. Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.